when he uses the analogy of a wound, it reminds me about...
The analogy of the?
Wound. Cicatrice, scar, wound.
Trauma.
It reminds me of the kind of gutted condition that you described in the state of exception, or for on the political level, but then also for on the individual level for Homo sacer.
Probably the Adorno model of subjectivity, also not only negative aesthetic, but is negative dialectics. No? Of course, it's not at all a strong positive notion of subjectivity, absolutely. No? It would be something perhaps more near to, which implies also experience of desubjectivation.
Okay, there's something that bugs me about the desubjectivation, and maybe I need help in formulating the question. But so we've gone through the subjectivation and that there is no pre-existing subject, or like the process itself is when we can speak of subject, but there is no subject before and no after. And then we talk about desubjectivation, which to me is a process as well, which means that in that process of desubjectivation there is a subject. Can we say that? And and maybe this is an unconscious process. So
it's a process, so to speak, of collapsing subjectivity. No? If the process implies a desubjectivation, this means that subject is splitting, collapsing. But we can imagine a lot of experience, practical experience, which we do have an experience of that kind. I think, for instance, and the two processes can coincide.
That's what
we'll
I
have
mean.
a process of subjectivity which implies let's take a very concrete model. The confession. Are you familiar with what the strong influence that the Christian confession had exerted in our culture, especially on Western subjectivity? But then a juridical confession is the same. So what happens in a confession? In a confession happens that a subject confessing his sin, his fault, or whatever, will renegade, will deny the subjectivity who had done this thing, and can no more be coherent with the new subjectivity, and in this process of negating, destroying, expulsing a subjectivity, a new subjectivity will be constructed. So in the confession, very empirically, very concretely, you see that the process of subjectivation, the creation of a new subjectivity, the Christian, goes parallel, coincides with the process of expulsing, negating, desubjectivating the sinner. And I think experience like shame. I think that in shame we have something, both experiences. What is the subject? What is the subject of shaming experiencing? The subject of shame is, from one part, experiencing something that he cannot accept. It produces shame. But then, in the very moment in which he is experiencing this impossibility of assuming something, for instance, I am naked in front of others, this I cannot assume, this produces me shame, this subjectivates me. But this, on the contrary, make me, like Levinas said very well, make me adhere to myself. In the very gesture in which I cannot assume this, I am completely consigned to this. The one who feels shame is both in the impossibility of assuming something, but strongly consigned to this. So it's both building a subjectivity and a desubjectivation. So we can imagine many processes in which the two things run together.
In fact, if you imagine in the juridical register the example whereby in law a subject has been held to be culpable for his or her acts, to have done something and then to bear the responsibility for having done that. But in modern jurisprudence, you have a kind of auto-deconstruction that has happened within law, such that you have a subject which is no longer culpable because I think of certain cases, I ate a Twinkie and the sugar affected me, and so I wasn't myself. So the idea of temporary insanity not only changes the position of subjectivity within a juridical and a legal sense, but changes those actual subjects, has an effect on what those subjects are. So another example, I think exactly as you were saying.
And then, for instance, you know that the Alzheimer
Condition?
Condition, Alzheimer's disease.
Was made by this Dr. Alzheimer on the case of a woman. And what struck him incredibly was the beginning of this woman speaking to him, and she said, "I lost myself." Here again, we had, "I lost myself, I'm completely desubjectivated, but I lost myself." There is a subject which is stating strongly the lose of itself.
Loss.
Loss of
Loss
self.
of itself.
Loss of self.
Can I just follow up, because you mentioned before when we started talking about desubjectivation, that this is a state reduced to extreme unconsciousness. Did I
No,
understand
because
it right?
then if we take the case of the Muslim
Yeah.
in Auschwitz, you
That's-
know, who was this? So this was a man who was reduced almost to a living corpse. It was he has no more conscience, no more. It couldn't speak to others. It was completely in a state of agony almost. So, and this was produced by Auschwitz, so it was a natural state. But then there you see that Auschwitz was meant to produce desubjectivation in that extreme form. Oh, we're not speaking to this now. But this is the extreme paradigm of something that in different and minor gradations we can experience. Not only when we are in a pathological status, but also in normal states.
So it sounds like within your understanding of the liturgy of the church, that there's a repetition of this desubjectivation, or subjectivation that happens almost every time one receives the Eucharist, because there's...
You think? Why do you think so?
The Eucharist always prior to receiving the Eucharist, the individual has to confess, at least in traditional standards. So there's a confession of one's sin. So you approach the altar then where the host lies, and you're nothing basically. You're empty, and then the idea is that upon receiving this, then you become one again with Christ. So it's not, because one of the words that came up during your lecture and that you used today is repetition. And so I'm just wondering if there's both a kind of constant repetition of desubjectivation, but also something more like a permanent state of desubjectivation that an individual is susceptible to.
Yes, I would say that our Western model of subjectivity, it is constitutively